It all started like any regular Friday. Earlier that day, Emma had sent me a text mentioning she'd be out for a work dinner. Her message had this casual tone to it, maybe a little too casual, if I'm being honest. Something about it didn't quite sit right, but I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired or reading too much into it. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake this nagging feeling, that familiar itch creeping in, telling me something was off. Around 8, I was absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone when a notification lit up the screen. One of her coworkers had tagged her in a photo, and curiosity got the best of me, so I clicked on it. The picture wasn't exactly scandalous, just a group shot in some trendy, dimly lit restaurant. But my eyes zeroed in on Emma immediately. She was leaning close, laughing, her hand resting lightly on the thigh of the man beside her. It wasn't much, just barely touching him, but something about it seemed deliberate, like she was putting it there on purpose. My stomach twisted. I stared at that photo for what felt like an eternity. There was something in the way she looked at him, relaxed, playful, like she didn't have a care in the world, that set off a storm of emotions inside me. This didn't look like the Emma I thought I knew. I zoomed in, studying her face, his face, every little detail of her body language, hoping I'd find something that would let me explain it all away. But the longer I looked, the worse that feeling got. Every pixel of that photo felt like a punch I hadn't seen coming. I could have messaged her right then or called to demand an explanation. But deep down, I knew I needed to handle this differently. I wanted to see it all firsthand. So, without another thought, I grabbed my jacket, picked up my keys, and drove straight to that restaurant. The place was upscale, sleek, and modern, the kind of spot where everyone's putting on an act, trying to be someone they're not. My heart was pounding as I slipped inside, scanning the room. It didn't take long to find her. There she was, sitting at a table toward the back, half hidden by a low wall and dim lighting, but I could see enough. Emma was all smiles, looking totally at ease, her whole body angled toward him like he was the only person in the room. He leaned in close, whispered something in her ear that made her laugh, and she playfully tapped his arm. A surge of anger hit me like a tidal wave. Taking a deep breath, I tried to keep myself steady. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out an envelope I'd grabbed on my way out. Inside were pieces of us, anniversary cards, love notes, little memories we'd shared. I wanted her to see just what she was tossing aside. I walked up to their table, and for a moment neither of them noticed me. Emma was too wrapped up in her world with him. Then, as I laid the envelope down, her smile froze. She looked up at me, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. I leaned in just enough so they could both hear me. "You left something behind," I said, my voice steady. Emma's expression shifted from shock to irritation, like I was the one crashing her evening. The guy with her, with his slicked back hair and smug grin, glanced between us, clearly entertained but trying to hide it. He gave me this quick, dismissive look, like I was just some random guy who'd wandered into the wrong place. Emma grabbed the envelope with shaky hands. I didn't say a word, didn't even raise my voice. I just stared at her, waiting. 1,000 questions ran through my mind, but I wasn't about to let her see the depth of my hurt. This was her mess to explain, and I was gonna watch her try to dig her way out. Finally, she cleared her throat, putting on this fake smile, the same one she used on waiters when she was being difficult. "What are you doing here, Jake?" Her voice was calm and sweet, like I'd caught her simply having an innocent chat with an old friend. I raised an eyebrow. "Funny. I was about to ask you the same thing." I gestured toward her hand, still resting on the guy's thigh. "You look comfortable." Her face went pale, but she recovered quickly, letting out a small, fake laugh. "Jake, you're being ridiculous. This is just a work dinner. You remember Paul from accounting, don't you?" She gestured to him, and Paul, or whatever his name was, gave a little nod, smirking like he thought this was all some grand joke. I could feel my patience wearing thin. Leaning over the table, I kept my voice level. Work dinners usually don't involve hand-holding or whatever that was. I pointed at her hand on his leg. She pulled it back like she'd been caught doing something as minor as checking her phone in a meeting, but her eyes flashed with defiance. She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Jake, you're blowing this out of proportion. Can we not do this here? You're embarrassing yourself." I took a step back, a bitter laugh escaping me. Embarrassing myself? This felt like some twisted game, with her constantly changing the rules. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw someone I didn't recognize. I felt like a stranger was sitting in front of me, someone more concerned about her appearance than the life we'd built together. Her colleague Paul, or whatever his real name was, shifted in his seat, leaning back with an air of complete indifference. "Maybe you should just leave, man," he said, his voice oozing with arrogance. It took every bit of self-control I had not to create a scene right then and there. Instead, I focused on Emma and laid out a choice for her, clear and simple. "You can come home with me now, or you can stay here with him. But know this, if you choose to stay, you're making a decision." Her gaze darted back and forth between us. For a split second, I thought she might stand up, apologize, and make this right. But instead, she looked away, pretending to be absorbed in her drink. That was the moment everything clicked for me. I realized where we stood. I walked out of that restaurant, my heart racing, barely able to catch my breath. Each step toward my car felt heavier than the last, as if I were slogging through a nightmare I couldn't escape. I had given her a chance, a straightforward, unmistakable chance to salvage what we had, and she dismissed it like I was just some jealous boyfriend she hardly knew. Sitting in the driver's seat, I gripped the wheel tightly, staring at the restaurant doors, half expecting her to come rushing out, begging me to talk, to apologize. But after 5 minutes turned into 10, and there was still no sign of her, I slowly came to realize she wasn't coming. She had made her choice to stay with him. I could have driven home, but something inside me resisted the idea of facing our house just yet. The photos lining the walls, the memories tucked into every corner, it all felt tainted now. So I just drove, no particular destination in mind, my thoughts replaying every moment from that night, analyzing every word she'd said. I thought about all the times I had defended her, trusted her, and believed her lies. Then something hit me like a gut punch: her business trips. She'd been taking those more frequently over the past few months, claiming she needed to meet important clients in different cities. Each time I asked if I could tag along, she brushed it off, saying it would be boring for me or that the schedules were too tight for us to enjoy ourselves. I'd laughed it off back then, thinking she was just trying to save me from long hours of her work meetings. But now, it all clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle. It had been a perfectly crafted lie. I pulled into an empty parking lot and sat in the darkness, my phone burning a hole in my pocket. For a moment, I thought about calling her, but what would be the point? I'd already witnessed her choice. Instead, I opened her social media, scrolling back through the months, my mind racing. I was searching for anything I might have overlooked, clues that had been right in front of me all along. That's when I stumbled upon a picture she'd posted from a work trip 3 months ago. It was a weekend when she'd claimed to be at a conference in Chicago. I remembered that weekend clearly because I'd cooked her favorite dinner, hoping to surprise her when she got home. In the picture, she was at a bar, drink in hand, laughing at something off camera. At first glance, it looked innocent enough, but then I noticed something else: her other hand, barely visible, resting on the arm of a man just out of the frame. Only his shoulder was in view, but it was unmistakably him, the same guy from the restaurant tonight. I couldn't believe it. She had been flaunting this right under my nose, laughing while I sat at home, blind and trusting. My hands trembled as I stared at the picture, feeling the betrayal dig deeper. How many other weekends and work trips had been nothing but lies? All those signs I had ignored, the excuses I had brushed aside, crashed over me like waves, each one a reminder of how thoroughly she had played me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of just how much she had shattered everything we had built together. In that silent parking lot, I finally let the anger surge through me. She had stolen moments from our life, twisting them into lies and convincing me of her stories and excuses. I realized I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't just go home and wait for her to walk through the door, as if nothing had happened. No, this was far from over. The next morning, I was running on empty, but something had shifted inside me. The shock had faded, replaced by a grim clarity. I knew I couldn't just confront her like any other betrayed husband. No, I wanted her to feel every ounce of what she had put me through. I needed her to understand that I wouldn't simply lie down and accept this. Emma texted me around 9 a.m., letting me know she'd be home later since her work dinner had run late. She tossed in an apology, making up some excuse about how busy the restaurant was, causing them to stay longer than planned. I couldn't help but laugh to myself, stunned by her audacity. She had no clue I already knew the truth, that I'd seen everything with my own eyes. So, I decided to play along and replied casually, "Sure, hope you had a good night." My fingers itched to type out something sharp, maybe toss in an accusation or two, but I held back. She wasn't expecting me to keep my cool. In fact, she probably thought I'd be an emotional mess. Staying calm gave me the advantage. All I had to do was wait. While I waited, I decided to dig deeper. I called her office, talking to her assistant under the pretense of planning a surprise trip. Casually, I mentioned a few dates Emma had supposedly been out of town for work. Her assistant's response was hesitant, stammering through gaps in the story. Turns out, those weekends weren't official business trips after all. But she was too flustered to ask questions, so I thanked her and hung up, feeling my stomach twist as the truth hit me all over again. Emma hadn't even tried to cover her tracks carefully, she just assumed I'd never think to check. By noon, I'd gathered enough evidence. I had a hotel receipt for a weekend she claimed to be in Boston, registered under her name but clearly booked for 2 guests. There were also message threads and social media posts showing her business dinners. That didn't match up with her timeline, and a close-up of that now infamous picture with Paul from her office. I compiled every bit of it into an envelope, the same kind I'd left on the table last night. But this one was fuller, heavier, an undeniable record of her deception, each piece of evidence plain as day. She got home around 4 p.m., slipping inside quietly. I was waiting on the couch, calm as ever, with the envelope right there on the coffee table. She looked at me, uncertain, like she wasn't sure of who she was about to face. "Hey," she murmured, setting her bag down by the door. "How was your day?" I motioned to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Emma. We need to talk." I caught a flicker of something on her face, a glimmer of guilt or maybe fear, but she quickly masked it, walking over with a composed expression. She sat down, crossing her arms, trying to look casual. "Is this about last night?" she asked, a hint of impatience in her tone. "Because I told you, Jake, you completely misunderstood." "Is that so?" I said, picking up the envelope and sliding it across the table. "Why don't you take a look at what I've misunderstood?" She glanced at the envelope, her face paling slightly, but she didn't open it immediately. Instead, she tried to pull on that familiar look of defiance, the one she wore whenever she felt cornered. "Jake, I don't know what you think you've pieced together, but you're blowing this way out of proportion. Whatever you think you saw, it's not what you think. Open it," I said, my voice calm but steady. She hesitated, her fingers trembling just slightly as she picked up the envelope. She pulled out the papers, her eyes scanning over the photos, the receipts, the notes I'd gathered. Her mouth fell open a bit, but no words came out. She just stared, like a deer caught in headlights. I leaned back, watching her crumble right before me. "So," I said, breaking the silence. "Care to explain? Because from where I'm sitting, it all seems pretty clear." She looked up, a flash of panic in her eyes, but still tried to hold her ground. "Jake, these don't mean what you think. Those trips, I really did go for work. Paul just happened to be staying at the same hotel, so we grabbed dinner. That's it, nothing more." I almost laughed. "Really? The same hotel, the same nights, every time?" She fumbled, shuffling through the papers, looking for something, anything, that could twist the story to her advantage. "It's not what it looks like, okay," she stammered. "This whole thing is a misunderstanding. Paul and I are just friends, Jake. Her voice was starting to rise, but I matched it with my own. Friends? Friends don't lie about where they've been, Emma. Friends don't go out for late-night dinners and hold hands at restaurants. And friends sure as hell don't take weekend getaways together while pretending to be somewhere else. I could see the realization hit her. She was trapped, and every excuse she tossed my way only made her lies more obvious. But even then, she wouldn't admit it. She'd rather dodge, argue, and fight than tell the truth. As I sat there, staring into the face of someone I no longer recognized, I felt the last thread of our marriage snap. Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Emma stared down at the stack of papers, her mind racing for a way to salvage her story. But she didn't apologize, she didn't show a single ounce of regret. Just that same look of defiance, as if I was somehow the one in the wrong for putting her in a corner. Finally, she tossed the papers back on the table, crossed her arms, and locked eyes with me, her voice dripping with irritation. Jake, do you even hear yourself? You've always been so paranoid, so clingy. If I can't even go on a trip without you tracking my every move, what does that say about you? I felt a surge of anger rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. Emma, this isn't about me tracking you. I only started piecing this together when I saw you with him last night. I wasn't the one sneaking around. She threw her hands up, scoffing dismissively. Oh, so you think this makes you some kind of hero? She shot back, her tone laced with sarcasm. Snooping through my life, barging into my work dinner, do you even realize how controlling that is? It was like she was trying to flip everything around, make this all about me as if I'd somehow crossed a line. The nerve of it made my jaw clench. I almost laughed, shaking my head in disbelief. Emma, I didn't have to go digging. You left the clues everywhere. You didn't even bother covering your tracks. She leaned forward, her glare hardening, calculating. Maybe I didn't bother because I knew you'd blow it out of proportion, Jake. I can't even breathe around you without you reading something into it. Her tone was sharp, dismissive, like she was scolding a child. You don't understand what it's like to want. I don't know, freedom sometimes. There it was, the admission hidden among 1,000 excuses. She'd chosen freedom, while I sat at home, loyal, managing everything, trusting her. And now she wanted to paint herself as the victim, accusing me of being clingy, of somehow driving her to this. I took a deep breath, feeling a storm simmering inside me. Freedom? I replied, keeping my voice calm but steady. Emma, I've given you freedom. You've taken trips alone, nights out with friends, as much time as you wanted. But this isn't freedom. It's deceit. And it's not about me being clingy, it's about respect. You've thrown that right out the window. She rolled her eyes, dismissing my words as if they were meaningless. Respect? She scoffed. Jake, you've always had these weird expectations for me. You wanted the perfect wife, didn't you? Someone who stays home, doesn't have her own life, someone just waiting for you every night. Her voice grew louder, her eyes challenging me. Well, I'm sorry I don't fit into your little fantasy. Maybe you should ask yourself why I had to look elsewhere to feel alive. Alive. She actually had the audacity to justify her betrayal with some vague need to feel alive. It wasn't an apology. It was an insult. A way to explain everything she'd done, as if her desires outweighed any vow she'd made to me. I stood up, my patience worn thin. Emma, if you wanted to feel alive, you could have just talked to me. Told me you were unhappy instead of sneaking around behind my back. I would have done anything to make this work. She watched me, her expression unreadable, like my words were just noise. I could see it in her face, she wasn't sorry. There wasn't a shred of remorse, no trace of empathy for what she'd done. Instead, she looked at me with that hardened, bitter expression, as if she'd been waiting to throw this at me for years. Maybe you would have, she said, her tone cold and final. But it's too late now, isn't it? There was a finality in her words that cut deep. I realized then that she didn't want to fix things, she wanted to hold on to her version of the story, one where she was the one wronged, the one justified in all she'd done. And with that I knew exactly where we stood. You're right, Emma. It's too late. I nodded, letting the weight of it settle. I reached down, picked up the envelope, and tossed it back on the table in front of her. Keep it. It's a reminder of everything you've chosen. With that, I walked out of the room, leaving her silence trailing behind me. I headed to our bedroom, shut the door, and leaned against it, absorbing the stillness of the house. I shoved the envelope into a drawer in the kitchen, somewhere out of sight but not fully out of mind. Someday, I'd figure out what to do with it. But for now, I needed to start fresh. When I opened the closet to grab a coat, my eyes fell on a small, dusty box she'd left on the top shelf. It was filled with keepsakes from our years together, ticket stubs, little notes, souvenirs from trips we'd taken. I hadn't noticed it in ages, hadn't even remembered it was there. I pulled it down and stared at the dusty lid, hesitating. Against my better judgment, I lifted it open. Inside were all the pieces of the life we'd built, love notes we'd written, photos from those early years when everything felt new and exciting, tiny trinkets from our travels. It felt like holding a time capsule from a life that no longer existed. I went through each item slowly, feeling the ache of each memory, each moment that had once meant everything to me. I realized just how much I'd been clinging to an illusion, a version of her that didn't exist anymore, maybe never truly had. The woman I'd loved had become a stranger, someone who could lie so easily, someone who had left me alone in this empty house, surrounded by the remnants of a life we'd never really shared. I closed the lid, not with anger, but with a sudden clarity. It was like finishing a chapter in a book, a chapter one knew I could never go back to, no matter how much a part of me wished I could. I understood now that holding on to this pain and these memories wouldn't change anything. It was time to let go, to make space for whatever lay ahead. And as I sat there in the quiet of the house, I finally let myself feel the full weight of it all. The loss, the betrayal, but also a surprising sense of hope. Emma had chosen her path, and now, so would I. The future lay ahead, blank and open, and for the first time, that didn't scare me. The next few days passed in a strange blur. I settled into a rhythm of work, errands, and long, aimless drives. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to keep myself from sinking back into the questions and memories that still snuck up on me at odd moments. I packed her things away, piece by piece, each item a fragment of a life I was finally letting go of. But as I went through those motions, I felt something shifting, loosening inside me, like I was coming up for air after being underwater for too long. With each item I boxed up, the house felt less like a painful reminder and more like a blank canvas. I'd look around and start imagining new possibilities, a different layout for the furniture, new photos on the walls, even small touches like fresh curtains or a new coat of paint. It felt like reclaiming this space, piece by piece, from the shadow of our past. For the first time, I could see a future in this place that belonged to me alone.